Good afternoon, everybody. This is Nuna at CLASP. I'm the project coordinator for the ASAP project, and I want to thank you all for joining the webinar today. We're going to give people just a couple of more minutes to join, and then we'll get started very soon. So thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Nuna Phillips at the Center for Law and Social Policy. I think I've met a lot of you in person. I'm the project coordinator for the ASAP project, and I want to thank you for joining the webinar today. This is a first in a series of webinars, and as topics and dates are finalized for future webinars, we'll be sure to communicate that information to the grantee leads, and hopefully you're able to join all or most of those webinars in the future. We're also going to make this webinar and future webinars available on the Secure ASAP website, and we're hopefully going to have that available, this webinar available by the end of the week. So as quickly as we can, we'll have those posted on the website. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you dialed into the webinar using your phone, be sure to mute your computer speakers because you might get an echo from having two audio sources. If you have a question during the webinar, please use the chat function that you should see in the little toolbar, the GoToWebinar toolbar. The chat function is the best way to submit your question to us, and we'll be sure to answer those throughout the webinar if we can get to them, and if not, we might answer some after. Now I'd like to hand it over to Jen Wagner, who will be presenting on today's topic, Understanding and Leveraging Technology to Promote Integration. Jen, please go ahead when you're ready.
All right, thanks so much, Nuna, and thanks everybody for joining us. We're really excited about this first webinar. So in all of your states, we all know that technology is having an increasingly large influence on what can and sometimes what cannot be done. Sometimes it's opening up new options for you all. Sometimes it's serving as a barrier to accomplishing what you seek to implement. This webinar is intended to give you some background on how you can advocate for improved technology and help your state maximize available federal opportunities. I consider kind of a subtitle of this webinar, stuff that I wish someone had taught us about 5 years ago. As we all know, a lot of these eligibility systems have gone through a lot of changes in the past 5-6 years, mostly in conjunction with the ACA. And well, we all, from inside the state to advocates to vendors, didn't know everything we should have back then, and that has caused some problems. We do know that these technology systems are going to have a tremendous impact going forward, and so the more we know, the better. So let's get started. Today's agenda, we're going to start by looking at the 90-10 and A87 cost allocation waiver. So just really looking at different ways of actually funding these projects. Then we're going to take a look at actual eligibility enrollment systems and the project development lifecycle to help you guys better understand some of the stages that the state is going through as they look to deploy a new system or make changes to an existing system. And lastly, we're going to cover how advocates can influence this process. And hopefully, if I talk quickly enough, which I'm sure I will, there'll be time for Q&A at the end. So let's start by looking at the 9010 and 87 cost allocation waiver. So the 9010 enhanced funding that CMS has made available is available for design, development, and implementation of eligibility systems, sometimes referred to as DDI. So as an example, staff time spent in design sessions for a new system, vendor costs for developing or changing a system, IT staff within the state, those are all eligible, potentially eligible for the 9010 funding. On the other hand, staff time spent actually doing eligibility determinations or policy staff writing ACA policy, outreach and enrollment, all of those things are ineligible for the enhanced funding because those are not part of the actual design, development, and implementation of the system. So what the 9010 funding does is it provides this enhanced match of a 90% match rather than the more traditional FMAP or 50-50 funding that goes to a lot of these functions traditionally. One key thing to remember is that it applies to the Medicaid share of the costs. So not the entire system, just the Medicaid share. This enhanced funding was originally through 2015, but luckily it has now been made permanent. And lastly, states are eligible if they meet what's known as the 7 conditions and standards. So these are some pretty technical requirements about modularity and automation, testing, interoperability. Not something that you really need to know in depth, but it's just good to understand what people are referring to. It's essentially an effort by CMS to make sure that these systems are more interoperable and that they don't need this whole big bang replacement approach in the future, that they're really taking advantage of some of the modern technology. Now, one of the things that you don't hear as much about is the 75% match. CMS has offered a 75% match for certain expenses, and this applies to ongoing Medicaid operations and maintenance. So the definition is it includes staff time spent on mechanized eligibility determination systems. Now, the good thing is that this applies to activities directly related to an eligibility determination. So that would be caseworker time actually processing Medicaid cases. Whereas I mentioned that is not eligible for the 9010, it is eligible for the 75% match. Now, in a minute, we're going to talk about the A87 cost allocation waiver, and I just want to point out that that does not apply to the 75% match. That only applies to the 9010 funding. Now, as I mentioned, the 75% match can apply to caseworker time spent on Medicaid cases. The good news is those caseworkers don't have to be exclusively working on Medicaid. In many states, caseworkers work on SNAP, TANF, Medicaid, other programs. And in states that have these integrated caseworkers, they can receive that enhanced funding for the Medicaid portion of the staff's time on these projects. Not the entire staff time, but the Medicaid portion can get this enhanced funding. So really, this makes a big difference. It did make a big difference in the past when people were talking about expanding Medicaid and the additional staff that might be necessary for that endeavor, and states were able to argue, well, okay, we'll get 75% match for the staff time. So it's been a good little bonus to state budgets. Next is a chart that just gives you a little bit of an idea of what's eligible for that enhanced 75% match versus what's eligible for the more traditional 50-50 match. And as you can see, the 75% match is related to those actual eligibility determinations. Intake, inputting information into the system, case maintenance, customer service. Things that are not eligible would be outreach and marketing, would also be for appeals, ongoing case maintenance, training, things like that are the 50-50 match. So there's a link to this chart at the end if you want to look at it in more detail, but it just gives you an idea of the difference here. So the third thing we want to talk about is the A87 cost allocation waiver. Now, OMB Circular A87 traditionally requires cost allocation among health and human service programs. And this applies to both staff time working on these programs as well as system costs. And so states are required to devise a method to allocate the costs among different programs. So for example, they might look at the number of cases on each program. They might do random moment sampling where they call or email or message staff and say, what are you working on right now? And the caseworker responds, a SNAP case, a Medicaid case, a SNAP Medicaid case, whatever it might be. And so traditionally, the states are required to allocate the different costs, and then they draw down the relevant match for each portion. So the Medicaid portion usually gets that 50-50 match. The SNAP portion also gets the 50-50 match. TANF usually doesn't get anything because it's a block grant, but that's how states divide system costs and staff time costs. So an exception to this cost allocation requirement was announced in August of 2011. And this also, like the 90-10, was originally through 2015. Fortunately, they have also extended this, not permanently, but through the end of 2018. Now, one of the key things to remember about the 87 cost allocation waiver is it applies only to system costs. It does not apply to staff costs. And the main test is that the expense must benefit Medicaid in order to qualify. So as an example, if your system has or if staff are developing, for example, a mobile app that is intended to manage SNAP, TANF, and Medicaid cases, that benefits Medicaid. It also benefits SNAP and TANF, so traditionally you'd have to kind of allocate it to each program, but because it benefits Medicaid, you can attribute all the cost to Medicaid, and that's eligible for this cost allocation waiver. On the other hand, something like tracking of TANF attendance and activity, that is a exclusively TANF functionality. You cannot argue that that benefits Medicaid, and therefore it would be ineligible for the cost allocation waiver. And in that case, the entire cost would have to be attributed to TANF. So again, the test is that the business process and the components must be shared with Medicaid. So let's take a look at how these different things impact system costs. So what you'll see from these charts is on the left is the way things would work in a more traditional environment without 90-10, 87. And you would take system costs and you might attribute it to the different programs that are benefiting. So in this case, maybe about 40% of the benefit goes to SNAP, that's in orange, 15% to TANF, and 45% to Medicaid. Now, if we look at the Medicaid portion, remember this is the traditional approach to it, Medicaid portion would be split about 50-50 between the state and the federal government. The SNAP portion would also be split 50-50, but right now we're just focusing on the Medicaid portion. And so as a result of this, you would say that CMS, the federal Medicaid agency, would pay 22.5% of the total cost of the system. So now let's apply the 90-10 funding to that, okay? With the 90-10, the chart on the left stays the same. The cost allocation among the different programs is the same. But of that Medicaid portion, federal CMS will now pay 90% of the Medicaid cost. So as a result, federal CMS goes from paying 22.5% of the system costs to 41.5% of the system costs. So a significant difference there. Now let's look at the impact of the A87 cost allocation waiver. Again, just A87, not looking at 90-10. So we've got the same original cost distribution in the left-hand chart. But when we look at the A87 waiver, look how it affects the larger pie. Now we say that of all the system functionality that we're building, let's say about 85% of that benefits Medicaid. Again, it's going to benefit SNAP and TANF as well, but because it benefits Medicaid, we're going to attribute it to Medicaid. The 10% for SNAP, the 5% for TANF, those are going to be things like employment and training, and maybe shelter deductions or something like that, that have no part in Medicaid, but can be attributed to SNAP and TANF. So if we've got a bigger piece of that pie attributable to Medicaid, and then we split that 50-50 between the state and the federal government, we see now that federal CMS is paying 42.5% of the total system costs. Again, increasing from 22.5% to 42.5%. Now, as you can guess, the biggest impact really comes when we apply both of these, the 90-10 and the A87. So let's look at the combined impact. Same chart on the left with the original distribution. But when we apply 90-10 and 87, we see that both parts of the chart is tremendously influenced. So we have 85% of the total system cost going to Medicaid, and of that 85%, we're going to attribute 90% to federal CMS. So the result here is that we go from federal CMS paying 22.5% of the total system cost to paying 76.5% of the total cost. So that's how 90-10 and A87 can work together to have a huge impact. So just to put it in terms of some numbers, let's look at a system cost that might be $150 million. Sounds crazy, but unfortunately is pretty realistic. This is obviously for a new system, not modifications to an existing system, but it's still quite costly. So applying those same distributions of Medicaid, SNAP, TANF, applying the federal and state matching rates, what we'd end up with is the state cost, without any of these waivers or or fancy things, the state cost would be $86.25 million for this new system, so a little bit more than half. Now let's apply 9010 and A87, and you'll see it has two major impacts. It changed the Medicaid portion of the allocation to 85%, and then it changed the cost distribution between federal and state governments to 90% and 10%. So what we see here is that now the state cost for a $150 million system is $27.75 million. So we've lowered the cost to the state by almost $60 million. So that's huge. That has a huge impact. But keep in mind that the state cost is still $27.75 million. This is not free. This is not 100% federally financed. So the system cost, change costs, all of that, there still is a portion that the state does have to come up with. Way better than it was before. 27 million is easier to find than 86 million, but there still is a cost. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how these things work together and why this current opportunity is so important. Because 9010, great that it's permanent, that's going to help moving forward, but the combination of 9010 and 87 really has a huge and wonderful impact on these system costs. So lastly, we just want to talk through how you get the money. What the state submits is what's called different types of advanced planning documents, or APDs. They may submit a planning advanced planning document, lots of planning going on there, PAPDs. That's funding for planning activities before they'd actually embark on system change. But what you'll see more often, especially at this stage of the game, is implementation advanced planning documents and advanced planning document updates. So IAPDs and APDUs. The IAPD is submitted when you're first ready to embark on a project, and the APDU is required annually or when there are material changes to the cost, to the schedule, something like that. So this is just for you guys to know. Some of you have looked at your state's APDs, some haven't. It can be some very technical information in there, so it may or may not be useful. If you can talk with your state about what's going on, how things are structured, that might be a little bit more informative than looking at these APDs, but in some cases you might want to actually try to get the actual APD. These are not public. States can see each other's APDs on a secure federal portal, but these are something that you would have to actually go to the state and request. One thing to keep in mind is if there is an integrated system that's looking at Medicaid, SNAP, other programs, the feds require approval from both HHS and FNS. So that can take some time and some finessing. So just to give you a little bit of insight into what the state is going through when they try to secure this funding. Okay. So we do have one question that came in during this portion, and that's for is training for eligibility staff or community partners on a new system part of DDI? And generally that is not. If you look back at the distribution between the 75 and 25, the 75% match and the 50% match, staff development and training is not covered. It does say except for operational readiness training. So there is a portion of training that can potentially be attributed to the higher match, but it's more likely to get the 75% match than the 90-10. That's for internal eligibility staff. For community partners, that would be a little bit of a stretch. So it's always worth making the argument, but generally it does depend. I guess I'd have to think more about exactly what that training would be because it is kind of part of implementation. So good question. Okay, so next we are going to go on to talk about what these actual eligibility system developments look like, what goes into actually building or modifying a system. So here you can just see I grabbed a screenshot of an old legacy system. This ugly green screen based, tends to be very code based, where if a caseworker wants to deny a case because somebody's not disabled, instead of entering that, they would often have to enter a code, you know, 0512, case denied because not disabled. As you guys have gone through data requests and stuff, I'm sure you've interacted with a lot of the coding that's in this legacy system model, and it's just archaic, it's very complicated. It's really a whole different language that workers have to use, and that can lead to a lot of errors and obviously intensive worker training to get them up to speed. What a lot of states are moving to is this more web-based system. I put up Compass here from Pennsylvania. It's actually the application, but it looks similar to what a back-end eligibility system worker might use. And instead, this is more of a drop-down menu type style, where if you're going to deny a case, you would choose from a drop-down menu and say deny. And if you would choose a reason, you would choose from the drop-down menu and choose not disabled instead of some goofy code. So there are a lot of advantages to switching to these new, modern, more flexible eligibility systems, as we all know. So looking at a project development life cycle, these are the different stages that a lot of states will go through as they either develop a new system for deployment or as they make modifications to the system. What you see here is an example that a state might have gone through trying to deploy a new eligibility system by October 1st of 2013 to begin intake for the newly eligible group, apply Magi, all of those things. It's going to look similar, but definitely compressed if you're looking at defect resolution or making enhancements to an existing eligibility system. Similar stages, but obviously the time frame is generally going to be a lot shorter. And some states and vendors might call some of these things just a little bit different names, but this kind of gives you just an idea of the flow that states have to go through. So let's go through each stage. First, planning. Very, very important. Unfortunately, it also often gets shorted a little bit just because of time frames. But the planning stage should really allow the state to set out a vision. What are they trying to achieve? Again, with a brand new eligibility system or with a more narrow change to the eligibility system. What are they looking at? Another part of the planning phase is scope control. A lot of people are tempted to fix all the problems in the world with a new system. And obviously, the more you put into it, the more chance of error there is, the more time it might take. And so it's important to really look at what's necessary for an initial stage and what other things can be added on later. You don't want to put the whole, let's integrate all of our health and human services programs in this new system. That's just not really realistic. And then governance is another key part of planning. And governance of the project does not mean the secretary or the director that's in charge of it or the governor's office. It's usually slightly lower than that. It's the people who are actually running the project day to day and making those decisions that have to be made constantly. Governance is really where a project will succeed or fail. It's a really hard thing for advocates to influence from the outside, but sometimes you can see that when governance is not as strong as it should be, there are a lot of consequences down the road. So after planning, states often go into the requirements section, where they develop a very detailed listing of what they actually want the system to do. Again, for a new system or for a modification to a system. It's often categorized as mandatory or desirable. And this is what's put out in a request for proposals or an RFP. And vendors review this and they propose a project and they say what of these requirements they can meet. They can either do it in the existing system, they can make modifications or whatever it is. And they bid, they provide a price based on meeting this list of requirements. Now the tricky part here is that if the state did not at the outset put down all of the requirements that they need and forgot one, that's often looked at as an enhancement because the project is bid, the price is set based on the requirements that were put out there. So any changes, any additions to that will cost more money in some ways. So that's a tricky part of that whole process. So next are a few examples from other states of requirements that they've put out in RFPs. And as you can see, they are very, very detailed. This is one tiny portion. Often these requirements there can be thousands of them that they're saying to the vendor, this is what I need the system to do. So just to give you an example where the arrow is on the right side, the system must display benefit issuance history with sort, filter, and query functionality. This must include at a minimum date of issuance, amount, vendor, provider, and mode and issuance type. Okay, so you can see how specific that is. But there's a danger of being too specific and there's a danger of being too vague. If they had not included this, the vendor might say, okay, well you can sort and filter by provider. So we did what you asked. And they'd say, no, I need you to sort by vendor and mode and issuance and all those things. And the vendor would say, well, you didn't say that, so we're not going to do it. And so that can be kind of some of the back and forth. Now, on the other hand, what if they later find out that they need to sort by some additional factor, name, I don't know, name or something that they didn't list here? And then the vendor might say, well, you didn't list that. And the state would say, well, I said as a minimum. The vendor might say, well, you listed these certain items that it has to sort by, I can do that, but I didn't include name because you didn't say that. So that reflects a little bit about the balance between being too vague and kind of painting yourself into a corner by being too specific. So very, very tricky area. So after the requirements are set, a vendor is procured or you move on to a development phase or the next phase of modifications to a system, you have design, okay? So design often starts out with requirement validation. And that's when you take all those kind of goofy things from the previous slide and figure out, well, what the heck does this actually mean? The vendor says, what do you need me to do? And so another example from that previous slide was the system must generate benefits on a staggered, non-staggered, and fixed issuance process based on business process and program rules. The business process and program rules, sometimes you put that at the end of everything and as a means of trying to get you a little more flexibility. But when you get into the design section, you don't get that flexibility. They're going to say, what does that mean? Okay, what is the staggered issuance schedule you want? What is the fixed issuance schedule? How do I actually program this into the system? Sometimes these design sessions are called fit gap sessions, and that's often if you're operating off of a transfer system. So a transfer system is taking an existing eligibility system from a state and bringing it into your state and modifying it to your particular needs. And so it's called a fit gap session because it looks at what you need, what the system does, and what the gap is between them. Oftentimes, if something's being developed from the ground up, you might have what's called JAD sessions, or joint application design. After these design sessions, there's usually produced technical design documents or storyboards, and that's for the staff to review and make sure that the vendor or the IT staff captured what they really intended. Now, this whole design session requires significant state resources, because you can see how critical it is. It's that stage where you take these requirements and actually put them into operation and figure out what will the system actually look like, both for the client and for the staff. And so you need your best people often in these sessions, not only laying out what they need, but also reviewing very carefully these design documents and storyboards to see what, make sure that the vendor or the IT staff accurately captured all the things that you have discussed. Now, in a new system design development and deployment, these design sessions, there's thousands of hours of design sessions, and you can often have 4, 6, 10 sessions going on concurrently, where you need, 8 staff in each. So you can imagine how many state resources have to be dedicated to this session. So it's something to just kind of think about as you ask for more things in the future from the state, that the more you ask for, it often requires pulling good people out of other roles in order to make sure this design session goes well. Necessary, but just something to keep in mind. So after design, the development session happens, and that's when the programmers really go to work and take what was on those design documents or storyboards and try to make the system do it. Sometimes they'll come back with questions or clarifications that they need, and that's good. That helps make sure that it's done right from the beginning. Next comes test. So first is often test by the vendor or the programmers, and they'll do unit testing and system testing. Unit testing is looking at one component. For example, does the system calculate the standard utility allowance right? System testing is then putting a bunch of those different units together. For example, running a SNAP budget. If I put the income calculation with the shelter deduction calculation, with the medical deduction calculation, do I get the correct SNAP benefit amount at the end? That's kind of the system testing. And that happens among the vendors and programmers. Then it moves into user acceptance testing, or UAT. And that's usually conducted by state or county eligibility workers. Again, another huge area that requires significant human resources. Got to be the state resources. You don't really want the vendor testing their own system, because they're going to say everything's A-okay, it's good to go. You need your own staff running through this. And what the staff do is they run through thousands of test cases, and they try to create everything you can think of. Mom, dad, and 2 kids, mom, boyfriend, and boyfriend's kid, and mom's niece, whatever it might be, and see if they can get the correct eligibility results from the system and log defects that happen along the way. Sometimes UAT can be done with live data, and that might be where you take an office or a region or whatever and have the caseworkers do double entry. So as customers come in and they're processing cases, they would probably process a case through the regular system that's in use at the time, and that will produce the result and the notices and everything. But they might enter the same data through the test system for the new system. And that would allow them to see with real data, as things actually are happening and real people are coming in, see if the new system gives the correct results that match what the old system did. A big part of UAT is categorization of defects. So oftentimes the defect that's detected is considered either low, medium, high, or critical. And this can lead to a lot of workarounds, because the categorization and the number of defects has a big impact on when a system's able to go live. Oftentimes the criteria for going live is to make sure that the system does not have any critical defects and does not have any high defects that do not have workarounds. So what you end up with is often going live with a lot of high defects with workarounds and tons of medium and low defects. So it's painful, but otherwise the system would often be in UAT forever, but it can lead to fights with the vendor on categorization of things and how critical this is, and if it needs to be resolved before go live, or if we can get it taken care of later on. So after UAT, or actually concurrently oftentimes with UAT, is training. And so there's sometimes internal training, obviously letting caseworkers know about new policies, how the system works. Sometimes the system will substantially change business processes and getting all the staff up to speed and ready for that. Then hopefully there's also external training. So providing updates and information to customers, to community partners, especially if there's some sort of a public-facing portal, like an online application, an online case maintenance portal. You want to make sure that the state is providing good information out to the public about what's going to happen and what to expect. Training begins before deployment, but should continue afterwards with refresher courses, tips and tricks. Hopefully there's staff at the state looking at what's going wrong, what's going well, what do I need to kind of reinforce with the staff to make sure that the system is working as well as possible. Now when deployment happens, very complicated. It's more than just kind of flipping a switch and saying, okay, we're deployed, let's do it. There's a lot of troubleshooting that's necessary, as there's so many things that you really can't know until the system actually goes into production and you see what's working and what's not. During this phase, especially immediately after deployment, communication is absolutely essential with staff on the ground, with vendors, with the project staff, with community partners, with the legislature, with the governor's office. Keeping everybody in the loop can make a huge difference and make sure people know, okay, this isn't working, but here's how you work around it. This is when it's going to get fixed. Obviously, it's not ideal, but the more information that's put out there, the more people are going to realize what's going on, understand the process, and be more patient. If communication fails, you will lose a lot of buy-in in the system from both staff and community partners, because they'll be so frustrated by the issues and not knowing what's going on that sometimes people just hate the whole system. So now after deployment, there's the maintenance phase, okay? Maintenance is usually a set number of vendor or programmer hours, and they are dedicated to both defect resolutions and enhancements. So defect resolutions might be things that were supposed to be working in the system but don't, and they're logged as defects. This could be some of those low, medium, and high with workaround errors are considered defects, and people work to resolve those. But there are also enhancements, which are new things that were not necessarily discussed in the design sessions but are necessary for the system. And it could be something people didn't think of. Oh, wow, in order to manage this, I really need a report that shows me the number of SNAP applications that I got before noon. Who knows what it might be, but enhancement, something that wasn't originally requested, but it is necessary. It can also be fancier things like adding a mobile app or something that was looked to be kind of a phase 2 or a subsequent phase of the release. Maintenance usually is used for regular release schedules. So you'll hear the state talk about the next release. These releases may be very frequent right after deployment because there are so many issues that need to be resolved often very quickly, and then it will shift to more of a regular schedule. So now sometimes you're seeing monthly defects, or monthly releases or bi-monthly releases, whatever it might be. Sometimes in between these scheduled releases might be emergency releases, and those are when something happened that is so bad that the system doesn't really function and you got to get it fixed immediately. Emergency releases require a lot of extra resources. Just the act of putting out this extra release takes a ton of time and attention. So states generally limit emergency releases to only absolutely essential things for the system to function. The maintenance phase may also include a knowledge transfer. In your state, you may be working with a vendor. That vendor may have a contract to maintain the system for the next couple of years. On the other hand, the vendor might have just been brought in to implement the new system, but it's then expected that maintenance, that all these necessary changes and such, will then be handled by internal IT staff. And so there may be a knowledge transfer portion where the vendor has to kind of teach the internal IT staff how to use the system, how to make modifications in the future. So the contract structure, if your state is working with a vendor, the contract is often fixed price. So it's based on the requirements that were in the procurement, and then that is structured around deliverables. You know, this will be done by this date, and payment is based on the vendor achieving different deliverables. And this is part of the reason why a vendor will stick very closely to those requirements, and any variation from those requirements will be considered enhancements. Because they're going to say, I agreed to get this much money to do this much. You're asking for something more, I need more money. Now, this fixed price nature is motivation for the vendor to complete the project on schedule, because they're getting a set amount of money. If the project is delayed, if it takes longer, and they're not getting any more money for it, that's not in their best interest. So they're going to try to say, everything's good, we met our deadlines, let's go live, we're done, or we go into maintenance or whatever it might be. And so the state often has to push back on that and say, no, you didn't do what you were supposed to, or get a little bit messy, as you've seen in a lot of the states where the eligibility system deployment has failed and the system is not working, can lead to lots of fights there. So the vendors acting in their own interest, you know, you understand what their motivations are, but it can just have an influence on how things are rolled out. Now, if more funding is needed, if you need to do something like enhancements or other things that weren't part of the requirements, sometimes the state will build in a little bucket of flexible funding into the contract, saying, okay, you're going to do all these requirements by this date and we're going to pay you this much money. But I'm also going to add into the contract $2 million for enhancements and things that we didn't think of. And so that allows for some relatively minor modifications, enhancements, changes to the system to be made without going through a whole dramatic contract amendment process. If the change that's needed is more substantial and can't be covered out of a task order bucket or something else, then you might have to go through an amendment. An amendment is usually where the state is adding additional funding to the contract. That requires generally a lot more hoops, like getting appropriation authority from the state. It might require procurement, additional federal approvals. An amendment process might be necessary, but it's a huge extra set of work. So if there's some big changes that need to be made to the system, you've got to look at, okay, is it something that can be done using the existing maintenance hours? Or do I need to really go, push the state to go through an amendment to get additional resources and really make this thing happen faster than a maintenance project would allow? Next, I just want to mention a few additional parties that you might see or hear about when you're discussing the system. Some states will have a project management office, and it might be internal to the state or it might be an external vendor. And they're really meant to supplement state resources in monitoring the vendor, documenting decisions, maintaining compliance. They're really meant to kind of shore up the state resources and give them more experience, more bodies to really manage this project. Certain projects that are deemed high risk, which is most of these eligibility systems for various reasons, they require an independent verification and validation vendor, or an IVNV vendor. And this agency must be completely independent from the state. And they really keep an eye on everything, review, make recommendations. Sometimes they'll bring in stakeholders and talk to them about how the process is going. They can help with risk management assessment and mitigation strategies. So these are required by the feds to say, okay, if you're spending this much of my money, I got to make sure I got an external party watching over things and making sure everything goes well. Now, just talk about a little bit of a few of the system features that can make these new, more modern eligibility systems so much better than the old legacy systems. One of these features is a rules engine. Okay, you might have heard about the states having rules engines now. And a rules engine is really separated from the code. It's kind of a separate program that contains really all the policy. What is countable income? What are allowable expenses? How do all of these things work together to get an eligibility result? And it used to be actually programmed into the code. And so when you made modifications, the programmers had to go in and find where it is in the code and change that. And one of the dangers was a change to this one part of the code might impact things, 1,000 lines down. And that may or may not be affected as well and changed, and it can lead to a lot of messiness and a very technical, lengthy process. What a rules engine does is it allows policy staff often to be trained and to make these changes outside of the actual code, which can allow for a much quicker time frame. And it allows the policy staff to actually write rules in plain English. If the household's income is above 130% of the federal poverty level, they are not eligible. And to kind of translate that into rules. It actually is a very friendly system. A lot of states use Corticon rules engine, And I downloaded a trial version the other day and was kind of playing with it. And it's, you know, obviously I'm not at level to actually program policy into there, but it's very friendly. It's something that kind of a more average person can play with and figure out, obviously get trained on. And it does a lot of good things like detecting scenarios not addressed. Well, you didn't tell me what happens if the household's under 130% or exactly at 130% of FPL. And it also allows you to run test cases and look at the results within that rules engine. So before you put it into production and before you have actual UAT folks test it out, you can run test cases within that module and try to fix as much stuff as possible. So it can be very beneficial. And so here's just kind of a visual about how a rules engine might work. There's input from the eligibility system, like the household size, income, expenses. The rules engine applies the different rules and calculations and sends back a result to the eligibility system. Now, what's significant here is, again, that the rules engine is kind of separated from the eligibility system, but it's also the structure that can be reused for additional programs. So think about LIHEAP or childcare eligibility. It's the same concept that you would get this input, you would make these different calculations, apply the rules, and get an output. And so a rules engine can be used for a lot of additional programs in a way that internal program code couldn't be used in the past. Additional features that a system might have or that you might want a system to have, data can be much better in these newer eligibility systems. Often you can get real-time information. Some of the legacy systems required overnight processing. So even if a worker processed a case, it didn't show up right away. It still might be on an overdue list, even at the end of the day. And so it was harder for managers and for staff to really track, did this get done today or not, because it wouldn't show up as processed until tomorrow. And so some of these systems are more integrated in a way that it doesn't require this overnight batch processing. And it allows managers to get more real-time information. They can sometimes see the number of cases due today, the number of people waiting to see a caseworker, all of those things, and have the flexibility to make different assignments to get those things. You know, they make adjustments throughout the day to meet those different needs. And the systems can also offer a lot more flexible reporting mechanism. You all have experienced needing certain data from the state. I need to know SNAP recipients between, you know, the number of SNAP recipients between 1 and 5 by county. And you usually had to kind of go to programmers to get that done. Now a lot of these systems have more flexible reporting mechanisms to allow you more people to be able to generate such reports. A lot of systems have public-facing portals, you know, allow people to apply online, manage their case, report changes, things like that. And sometimes the public-facing portal also has notices. They can be associated with somebody's account, and the person might get an email saying, hey, you have a new message in your account. Can even generate text messages sometimes. Another new thing is mobile apps. A handful of states have mobile apps right now associated with their systems, and they're great. You might think at first that you want a mobile app to actually allow somebody to apply for benefits through their smartphone. That's not always the best use of a mobile app, because imagine completing a SNAP application on your iPhone. That'd be a whole lot of information you'd have to input into tiny little fields. The best use people have found for mobile apps is to allow customers to take pictures of documents and electronically upload them to their account and submit them to the state that way. That can save a whole lot of procedural denials, that can save hassle on the part of the recipient, and that can also ensure that more documents are submitted electronically, which requires less staff time required for scanning documents. They're submitted electronically already and already associated with the customer's account. That saves a lot of effort on the state's part. Some states have put together either data or a portal for community providers, navigators, assisters to use. This often would have the ability for that provider or assister to track the applications they've submitted and see what's been approved, what hasn't, follow up with a client if more information is needed, hopefully reach out to the client at renewal, make sure it's completed, things like that. A lot of the systems also have integrated document management so that the electronic documents are connected to the system, so that if a new change report is received and submitted, it would actually trigger a task for the caseworker saying, we have a change on this, you know, this case, log in or bring up this case and complete the task. Some states have added appeals and other things to the eligibility system to modernize those functions as well. And then you'll sometimes see employment and training, like for SNAP and TANF, added to the eligibility systems. Some states have added other programs like LIHEAP, childcare, other things like that. Some are looking at WIC or other programs to add as well. So now let's talk about how advocates can influence this whole process. These pictures are just a joke. I'm sure nobody from your human service agency actually doesn't want to hear from you. I just wanted to give you guys a laugh. But one thing to think about is the potential uses of the enhanced funding that's available. You might want to push the state to have more maintenance resources. You might find that there are all these things, all these defects that need to be resolved, all the enhancements that should be made, and the state constantly says, well, that can't fit in this release. We only have 100 hours. We can't do this in this release. We're not going to get it done until 2017. So you could push them to do a contract amendment or whatever is necessary to get more maintenance resources. Another option is to enhance the integration of the system, push them to align, coordinate the renewals better, utilize the SNAP data for Medicaid or whatever it might be. Workflow management improvements can be very important to really ease the process for the caseworker. You know, are they having to look up electronic data sources separately outside of the eligibility system to log into all these databases to see if they're getting unemployment or Social Security? Or has the state actually integrated these data sources so the worker presses a button and gets all the results at right in front of them? Obviously, notices and electronic notices are very important and have a lot of room for improvement. That's something that can be done with this funding. Some states might be looking to add those other programs that we discussed into their eligibility systems. There's a possibility for greater automation. This can be a real-time eligibility for Medicaid application. Is the state doing it? Does it make sense for the state to do that? It can also be other things that you might not initially think of, like using some of the enhanced funding for computers or dual monitors. When I worked for Illinois, all the caseworkers had computers with 512 megabytes of RAM. They could not open a PDF. It took them 25 minutes for their computer to load in the morning. So we used enhanced funding to get everybody new computers. And that made more of an impact than 90% of the other things we did. So something to think about. Also, if your state is looking at setting up a call center, there's potential to use this enhanced funding for the infrastructure, for voice over IP and kind of management functionality within the call center. And another consideration is data interfaces. Is your state using all of those electronic data sources that are out there and that are helpful for making eligibility determinations without reaching out to the client? And so can you get more of those in the system? So a few cautions, things to think about. Remember, as we talked about earlier, this is 90-10 funding, not 100%, and that enhanced 90% funding only applies to the Medicaid portion. So anything that's done is going to have a state cost, way lower than it would be otherwise, but it is a constraint on the state, especially in this time of tight budgets, or for 2 of our states, no budgets. In order to make any changes to the system, you still need participation of substantial county and state human resources in the requirements development, in the design sessions, in the UAT, all of that. In order to take advantage of the 90% funding and the 87 allocation waiver, you really do need strong collaboration between Medicaid and human services. Sometimes that's in place in states, sometimes that's a big obstacle that needs to be overcome before you can really maximize this. One thing to consider, advice I give to people, is to avoid shiny objects. You know, there's a lot of neat things out there, from kiosks in the lobby, apps, all kinds of stuff. And so sometimes people think, ooh, that's cool, my state should have it. Just think through that enhancement in the overall flow of your operations. Would that actually help things? Or is that just kind of a neat thing, but really wouldn't make a substantial impact on a client experience? And just remember that the enhancement must be linked to Medicaid to get enhanced funding. So again, changes to employment and training, that's going to be exclusively SNAP or TANF and not eligible for the funds. Let's see. Next slide. Okay, so a few advocacy tips. One of the big things kind of structurally is to make sure that there's a mechanism for providing input. Some of you all have this in existence, some need to strengthen it a little bit. But you want to really be able to make yourself useful to the state, and that's going to make them talk to you a lot more. So one of the key things that advocates can do is bring the client experience to the state. From the state's perspective, the system might be great and the caseworkers love it, but the client is having trouble, or this particular screen is causing a lot of confusion. And that's information that you guys can bring them. As you have in so many other issues in the past, the client experience on the system can have a big impact as well. In these meetings, or whatever mechanism you're able to establish, it's great to make suggestions about needed improvements. And a key thing is to bring examples of successes from other states and systems. A lot of these systems are very similar across states. So for example, New Mexico, Illinois, and Pennsylvania are all using the same base eligibility system. So if there's some problem that one of these states has solved, let your state know. Hey, Pennsylvania did something really great here. Illinois, you should do that as well. It's possible in this system. And that's some resources that the state often doesn't have time to chase down and might not be aware of. In general, you want to think long term. You know, there will be an opportunity for modification. If the state says, I can't get it in this release, okay, it might take months longer, years longer than you wanted, but the key thing is to get it in there eventually. You do want to push the state to include as much as possible, but also to prioritize. If you ask for the whole world, they're going to kind of blow you off. But if you're really clear about, okay, here are the 3 things that are key, here are some other things. And that'll help the state kind of sort through it and say, okay, well, this was a little further down the priority list, but I can easily fit this in collaboration with a different change that I already have scheduled for August. And so that helps them kind of see the whole landscape and try to work in what they can when they can. One of the key things here is to push the state to commit to improvements while the cost allocation waiver is available. They are probably very tired. They've done a lot of change in the past number of years, and so they might be just thinking about getting by day to day. You have 2 key things here that allow states to get things done: funding and a deadline. Those are things that actually make the state move. So this funding is available, but only through 2018. So to frame it like that, like, okay, you can't just blow me off and tell me to come back in 2 years when the system is stabilized. We've got till 2018. These are the things that need to be done. And another key thing is to make the case for how the changes benefit the state, the workload, expenses, budgets, things like that. The state does care about the client, about the recipient. They do, but sometimes what's in their face, in their ear all day long, it's more about budgets, about deadlines, about the workload that caseworkers are experiencing. And so if you can make a case for how your changes benefit that can make them more interested. And just be aware of state constraints. As we discussed, they've got a lot to work with on procurements, contracting, and things like that. And the more you understand that, the more you can help them be effective within those constraints. A few more tips is to definitely make sure you have a good mechanism for receiving updates. There are going to be issues with each deployment. There's always going to be issues no matter how much testing is done. And so the community partners, as you know, can really mitigate the impact if they know what the problem is, what the workaround is, when it's going to be fixed. So make sure that the state is communicating to you. You know, if you approach them and say, I know there are going to be issues, you just need to let us know about it, versus just berating them for the issues, which you can do also, but it's important to make sure you have that mechanism for communication. It's great if you can provide cover to the state when needed if they're trying to do the right thing. So some of your states are really trying to do good things, and there are going to be bumps along the way, and sometimes they get jumped on by the legislature, by the media, whatever. Well, if that's really just a little bump in the road, but the road is leading to something great, it's important to provide them a little bit of cover and say, hey, this happened, but we're going to fix it, and where we're going, it's worth all of these bumps along the way. And applaud the state for things that go well. That's really important. They need that. And as I mentioned before, recognize their change fatigue. Recognize how much they've done in the past couple of years, and then tell them to get over it and make these changes, but just be aware that they've gone through a lot, that they're probably kind of tired. They might need a little push to take on new additional tasks. And one of the key things that you guys have generally done a great job on is engaging diverse stakeholders who can add to your voice. So it's important for the state to listen to advocates, and you guys have a seat at the table, and your voice is critical. But it might be more helpful if you're talking about renewals to engage the managed care organizations, because losing people at renewal has a huge impact on them. And so that's a different voice. How are the retailers effective when there's an impact on the SNAP distribution, something like that? Those additional voices can make a huge impact on these system design issues. So, few suggested action steps. Really look at a wish list. Lay out for you what are things that you want to see changed in the system by 2018. Bring those to the state. Ask them what their plans and priorities are for the next 3 years. Are they consistent with what you're asking about, or are they completely focused on timeliness or accuracy or adding another program to the system? And as I mentioned before, connect your recommendations to some of their points of pain so that they will be more amenable to your suggestions. And the key is to get these commitments to improvement with that looming 2018 deadline. in front and center. That sounded like really distant back in the day, but seeing as how it's somehow 2016, that's not as far off as one might think. Now, the last point is very important. Right now, there's a very friendly federal administration. They want this to work for states. They want to give away money using 9010 and 87 to states, for states to use to create new systems, to integrate systems and things like that. And so they're going to very likely help you and help the state find a way to make a case for these different things. So some things that are on the edge a little bit about, you know, training. Well, where does training fit in? Some of your states have very separated SNAP and Medicaid, and so you're making kind of a creative case how a benefit to SNAP actually benefits Medicaid. Go ahead, go to them, make the case, and take advantage of this friendly administration while they're there, because it can really be a huge advantage, and they'll try to make it work for you. So here are a few resources of different things that some of this has been included in the presentation, but if you really want to dive into the 7 conditions and standards or what that cost allocation waiver really looks like, here are a couple of different resources for you all to check out. And that top page, that's top resource on state innovations and horizontal integration, that's a paper that CBPP and Social Interest Solutions did, profiling a few states. And so it could be interesting to just read through and see what states have done and if there are some ideas for you all to use in your states. So we have a few minutes left for questions. I'm sorry I took so much of the time. We do have a few questions that have come in already, so we'll take a look at those. One question is, can we FOIA our APDs? Yes, I believe so. I think those would be subject to FOIA. The tricky part, and part of the reason that APDs are often confidential, is because the state is requesting approval from the federal government to spend a certain amount of money, sometimes before they actually put out an RFP or before they finalize a contract with a vendor. So if a vendor knows exactly how much the state intends to spend, that can really affect the bidding process. And so that's part of the reason that those tend to be confidential. So in some cases, depending on where they are in different stages, that could be denied as confidential. But I think really a lot of the APDUs and stuff at this point would be subject to FOIA. So let's see here. What are some examples of things that can be considered low, medium, high, or critical defects? So a critical defect is that this page doesn't work. I can't move past this page. When I hit next, nothing happens, or I get an error. That obviously prevents a worker from doing the eligibility determination. A high defect might be something that has a workaround. So I can't enter this type of income, but I could just put it down as earned income and you get the same result, even though really it's a slightly different, something like that. You know, where you can maybe fool the system or do something different to make sure you still get the result. A low defect might just be that, you know, this box, a box pops up and it can't be maximized. It's too small. You know, something like that. That has an impact on the caseworker, but the system's still going to go live, and that's going to go into a defect list that is eventually going to get addressed through maintenance. So those are just some little examples. Another question is, what is the CMS turnaround time on amendments? I don't know the exact number of days, but traditionally, CMS and FNS have taken a long, long time, sometimes months, to review these and approve them or not. And they have made tremendous efforts to streamline the process in light of the fact that so many states are making modifications to their systems right now, submitting APDs, amendments, APDUs, all those things. So if everything is submitted timely and completely, they are getting it back in a much shorter time. So let's see, another question is, does the 9010 enhanced funding have to be paired with an A87 waiver, or can a state opt to pursue just one of these funding mechanisms? Great question. They do not have to be paired. So in a system that is not very integrated and it's just a modification to the Medicaid portion of the system, and you just get the 90% funding for that, that's totally fine. It would be unusual for you to use the A87 waiver without using that 9010, because what the A87 waiver allows you to do is attribute more of the system cost to Medicaid. So if you're going to attribute more of the system cost to Medicaid, but then not utilize the 9010, that's unlikely. So, but the 9010 can definitely be used without the A87. And that's what's going to happen after 2018, when the A87 waiver is set to expire. Another question is, are there opportunities for advocates to be involved in aspects of system testing or staff training? And so, if so, what would this involvement look like? There are a lot of different examples from the states. It's sort of unlikely that a state would allow advocates to be on the actual system testing of the back-end eligibility system, because that's something that only caseworkers are going to use. But sometimes the state will allow advocates to participate in the testing for the public-facing portal, so for the maybe online application or case maintenance module. And that's great. I mean, the state is wise to do that because, first of all, they get more resources. You know, they don't have to use their caseworkers to test the application. And they also can get very good input from advocates like you who are the ones who are going to be using this ultimately. As far as involvement in staff training, that depends a lot on your relationship with the state. Some states do share some of their training materials with advocates, and advocates have a chance to influence it or to correct it or things like that, but a lot of states just kind of treat that as an internal thing and don't really allow advocates to be a part of that. So something you can always ask, but it's going to vary state to state. And I think we have time for one more question. Once a modernized eligibility system is implemented, how do state agencies typically prioritize changes and fixes? And how can advocates most effectively present new problems and get this on the priority list? There's a lot of factors that go into how a state prioritizes their maintenance resources. One of the biggest is the feds. You know, if federal law has changed, or if the feds are coming down and saying, hey, you have to fix this in the online application, you have to correct this, they're often going to put that to the top of the list. Other things would be things that have a huge influence on caseworkers, you know, take a lot more time to change, or, you know, some of the more substantial defects. So how advocates can really present new problems and get those moved up on the priority list is, I think the best way is to really connect those changes to points of pain. Well, because of this error in the system, the client receives the wrong message and they don't do the right thing, then they get denied and have to come in and reapply, and your caseworkers are having to spend twice as much time on the case. Okay? Obviously, horrible impact on the client, and mention that as well. But by connecting it to things that the state thinks more about, that might be an opportunity for them to really move that up on the priority list. Okay? So it looks like we are about out of time. A few additional questions have come in, and we'll take a look at those and get some more information out to you guys afterwards. But thank you so much for your participation today. It was great to have you. And as we have individual meetings with you all moving forward, please feel free to bring up any questions that we haven't addressed, or if you want to talk specifically about how these different provisions apply to the situation in your state, we look forward to those conversations. So thank you again so much for joining us and for your great work on this project, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.